Let's continue to focus on today's theme, get it right the first time, but from a labeling perspective. My name is Rachel Gay, and I'm the Director of the Division of Labeling Review. For this presentation, myself and Deputy Director Commander Catherine Wan will be presenting on generic drug labeling, recommendations for high-quality submissions. We hope that by the end of today's presentation, that we will have provided you all with useful and valuable information when it comes to the labeling portion of your ANDA application. Before we get started, let me go over the learning objectives of today's presentation. We'll start off with going over what the Division of Labeling Review does, as well as what we review, followed by an overview of the labeling review process to give you all an idea of how the labeling portion of the ANDA application is managed. After, we will provide responses to questions we often hear from industry and provide useful recommendations for submitting high-quality labeling submissions. Finally, at the end of our presentation, we have a couple challenge questions for you all in the audience and resources we'd like to share with you that we think are valuable for you with regard to generic drug labeling. So let's begin our discussion with an overview of a Division of Labeling Review. Here in the Division of Labeling Review, we ensure that labels and labeling are clear and accurately reflect the drug product information. In addition, our division ensures that the generic drug labeling is the same as the product's reference listed drug, or RLD for short. Generally, an ANDA's labeling must be the same as the RLD's labeling. There are, however, with regard to labeling, certain exceptions as to when differences between the ANDA and RLD labeling are allowed, which are described in 21 CFR 314.94, Section A8. At the time of approval, a generic drug is required to have the same labeling as the RLD, except for changes required because of differences approved under a suitability petition or because the generic drug and the RLD are produced or distributed by different manufacturers. There are also other differences that are allowed under this regulation, such as the omission of an indication or other aspect of labeling protected by patent or exclusivity, and labeling revisions made to comply with certain FDA labeling guidances or guidelines. Importantly, it should be noted that these allowable differences should not render the generic drug product less safe and effective than the RLD product. So a little bit about what we review in the Division of Labeling Review. Well, depending on your drug product, we may review a variety of different labels and labeling to include prescription information, structured product labeling, medication guides, patient package inserts, and instructions for use, container labels and carton labeling, blisters, overwraps, and stickers. But rest assured, all the labeling included in your drug product will be reviewed by our division, as well as data elements for structured product labeling. So now we're going to move on to provide an overview of the labeling review process. So here in this slide is a schematic of the labeling review process that we take. Essentially, once the regulatory project managers, or RPM, triage the ANDA submission, the RPM will pass along the ANDAs to the appropriate disciplines. One of those disciplines is labeling, and the labeling project manager, or LPM, will receive the ANDA assignments from the RPM. In the Division of Labeling Review, we have 17 and 6 LPM. And depending on the drug product, the LPMs will assign the labeling portion of the ANDA submission to the labeling reviewer. The labeling reviewer will then evaluate your ANDA submission and document any deficiencies they encounter during the course of their review. Once their assessment is completed, and depending on the extent of deficiencies, meaning if deficiencies only come from one discipline or from more than one discipline, either the LPM or the RPM will communicate these deficiencies back to you as the applicant. And with that, now I'm going to virtually hand over the presentation to Commander Catherine Wan so that she can go over frequently asked questions from industry and recommendations for submitting high-quality labeling submissions.
Thank you, Rachel. Good morning, everyone. I know it's a challenging time right now with the COVID-19 pandemic, but I'm glad we're able to have this opportunity to present to you some helpful tips and recommendations which will allow you to improve the quality of your labeling submissions. First, I'm going to go over frequently asked questions we've received in the past when we presented to companies at different forums, as well as questions we've received through email or control correspondences from applicants. When it comes to frequently asked questions, this is a question we receive quite often. What is the official FDA website for applicants to obtain RLD labeling? And the website you should go to obtain the RLD labeling is drugs.fda. Please remember this website and add it to your favorites on your web browser, because this is a website you should check regularly even after your ANDA gets approved to keep up with the RLD updates. I want to emphasize the fact that you should not rely on other publicly available labeling, such as those posted on DailyMed. If you can't locate the RLD labeling, choose labeling from one of the ANDAs on the market that references the same RLD as your drug product. The more recently approved ANDAs are the ones you should look for if you are to use that as your model labeling. The DLR labeling assessor will review your proposed labeling during our review of your application and provide comments if your proposed labeling is inadequate. When the RLD labeling is approved, the labeling is usually posted on the Drugs.fda website within 2 to 3 days. However, there may be situations when the labeling isn't posted within that time frame. At the bottom of the page on the website, there's a Contact Us link that you can use if you would like to reach out to us to make us aware and get the RLD labeling posted. You can also use this link if you have any questions about the labeling posted on the Drugs.fda website. Moving on to the next question that we frequently receive, how soon should ANDA update their labeling after an RLD update airs? If your application has not been approved yet and is still under review and you find that the RLD labeling has been updated and is different from what you initially submitted, please send in an amendment with updated labeling as soon as possible. This allows us to continue with the labeling review and saves us time from having to contact you and wait for a new labeling submission. If your application is already approved, there is no mandated timeline as to when you must update your labeling. However, we recommend updating at the earliest time possible because prompt revision of your labeling, submission to the FDA, and implementation of the updated labeling are important to ensure continued safe and effective use of your drug product for healthcare providers and patients. And you as the applicant have an ongoing obligation to ensure labeling for your drug product is accurate and not false or misleading. One thing to note, if you are just submitting an updated labeling to align with the most recently updated RLD labeling, you will need to submit a CVE 0 labeling supplement to the FDA for our review. Here is another question that we often receive. What to do after a new monograph becomes effective after ANDA is approved? The applicant is responsible for ensuring that their drug product complies with the requirements of the USP monograph once it becomes official. Changes that are made to comply with the USP monograph is annual reportable, and you do not need to submit a separate supplement. However, if there are other changes, as well as changes that need to be made to comply with the current monograph, please submit a supplement. I would like to refer you to the FDA guidance, Changes to an Approved NDA or ANDA, because this guidance is very useful in determining the reporting categories and how those changes should be submitted after approval of your application. The next question, can medication guides be provided to patients electronically? And we received this question in the context of companies letting us know that their medication guide is electronically available on their company website, and whether the website address can be included in the prescribing information and medication guide. If you look at 21 CFR Part 208, specifically under 208.24, it states that the manufacturer of a drug product is responsible for providing means to produce the medication guide in sufficient numbers to distributors and dispensers. And it also states that the dispenser of a prescription drug product is required to provide a medication guide directly to each patient. So in summary, this means that from manufacturer to the pharmacy, it is acceptable to include the URL for the medication guide in the prescribing information and medication guide, as this is considered providing a means to provide the medication guide for the patient. The pharmacist can type in the URL on the internet and print out the medication guide if it's necessary in order to dispense to the patient. However, from the dispenser to the patient, which would typically be the pharmacist to the patient, a physical copy must be provided. A pharmacist can't just give the patient the website address where the medication guide can be accessed. However, pharmacy computer systems automatically print out the medication guide if there is one for that specific drug when the prescription is processed, so having copies to provide to the patient isn't usually an issue. One more thing to add about medication guides, if you plan on including a website address for the medication guide in your prescribing information and medication guide, we also recommend that you add a statement to the immediate container and carton, which identifies the link to the electronic medication guide. However, we understand that there may be some space limitations, and this is not always possible. The next question is, how should ANDAs address removal of the pregnancy category? The Pregnancy and Lactation Labeling Rule, PLLR, was published in December of 2014 and went into effect on June 30, 2015. And this final rule requires changes to the content and format for information presented in drug labeling in the Physician Labeling Rule, PLR format. And as part of this rule, all prescription drugs should remove the pregnancy categories, which are the letter categories A, B, C, D, and X. For ANDAs, if the RLD labeling is in a PLR format, the applicants can remove the pregnancy categories only after the RLD removes it from their labeling. If it is in non-PLR format, ANDAs can remove prior to the RLD, and you can report this change in your next annual report. Or if you have other changes that require submission of a supplement, you can propose the removal of the pregnancy category with other changes. Now I'm going to switch gears and move on to sharing some helpful tips and recommendations for you to provide a high-quality labeling submission and hopefully reduce the number of labeling review cycles for your application. Some tips I would like to start off with is when you submit your labeling pieces, please submit draft labeling for your prescribing information and other patient information that may follow, such as medication guides, patient package information, and instructions for use. Please ensure you are submitting a text-based version of PDF and an MS Word file. For PDF, please do not submit a scanned version because this makes it difficult for labeling assessors to do a side-by-side comparison of your labeling and the RLD labeling. In addition to submitting draft labeling, please submit the final printed labeling as well. And ensure all forms of labeling pieces are consistent. Quite often we see that information in the draft labeling, final printed labeling, and or SPL are not consistent and that there are discrepancies. Moving on to more tips for high-quality labeling submissions, I would like to emphasize to you the importance of checking the following 3 websites prior to submitting your labeling materials. First, go to the Drugs at FDA website to see if there is a newly approved labeling for your RLD. Second, check the Orange Book website for any patents and exclusivity information that are listed under the references to drugs, and if there are, you must address these. Third, go to the USP website to see if there is a monograph for your drug product and whether there are any recent changes for labeling requirements. Also, you should check the USP website regularly for any pending changes that you need to prepare for. I mentioned this in my previous slide, but please make sure you are using the RLD labeling that is posted on the Drugs at FDA website for your model labeling. Please do not use DailyMed. Another tip I want to share is regarding warning statements that may exist on the carton or container of the RLD product. If there is such a statement, please ensure its prominence for all pertinent labeling pieces. A good example of this type of statement is shake well before use. We recognize that your product packaging may be slightly different from the RLD, but it's best to be as similar as possible to the RLD in terms of the prominence or placement of the statement. Here are some final tips that I would like to share with you for high-quality labeling submissions. First is regarding the Form FDA 356H. Make sure your form is up to date, especially with the point of contact for your company, as well as the company address. If there are alternate points of contact, please list them on the 356H form. And when you fill out Section 20, which is the basis of your submission, ensure the relied upon NDA RLD is accurately listed. Listing the incorrect RLD may have significant ramifications for your application. Also, I would like to ask you to refrain from making any unnecessary and unsolicited changes, especially right before your goal date. Needless to say, any labeling changes you include will need to be reviewed by us, and this can lead to an extension of the review cycle. One final tip I would like to leave you with is when creating your proposed ANDA labeling, it is best to be the same as the RLD except for manufacturing differences for your drug product. When it comes to ANDA labeling, being creative is not always a good thing. There may be rare situations when there is incorrect information in the RLD labeling, and you can point this out in your submission, or you can reach out to us to get clarification. Rachel will go over ways to contact us at the end of the presentation. With that, that concludes my portion of my presentation, and I will hand it over to Rachel to go over a couple of challenge questions to see if you remember some of the information that's been shared with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. So now let's jump into a couple of challenge questions. The first challenge question is as follows. The official FDA website for applicants to obtain the RLD labeling is DailyMed. True or false? If you answered false, you're correct. So DailyMed is not the official FDA website to obtain the RLD labeling. Rather, Drugs at FDA is. So please, when you need to obtain RLD labeling for your application, you should do so by going to Drugs at FDA to retrieve this information. Challenge question number 2, and our last question. Does the ANDA applicant need to update their labeling even though the ANDA is not being marketed? Yes or no? If you answered yes, you're correct. As indicated earlier in our presentation, and as per 21 CFR 314.92, the ANDA labeling must be the same as the RLD labeling. The labeling should align with the RLD labeling until the ANDA withdrawal has been published in the Federal Register notice and the effective date of the Federal Register notice has passed. All right, so we're coming to the home stretch of this presentation, and we're going to end it by going over some ANDA-specific resources and communications, which we believe will be valuable for you as you develop and plan to submit your ANDA application. There are a number of valuable resources for you to use and to look into, which are important for the labeling aspect of your ANDA application, such as the regulations found in the FDA&C Act and CFR, Orange Book, Drugs at FDA, which we went over earlier in the presentation with regard to obtaining RLD labeling, USP for monograph, and we've included a site that has a slew of prescription drug labeling resources. And actually there's a section specifically dedicated on that webpage dedicated to ANDA-specific labeling resources. I really encourage all of you to dive into those resources if you can. In addition, there are a number of FDA guidance documents which we have listed here on this slide that provide the agency's current thinking and recommendations on various aspects of ANDA labeling. We also highly recommend you look through these, if appropriate, for your application. And lastly, here's a list of contacts for further questions that you may have or run into. And we recommend that you follow these mechanisms here. If you have a specific ANDA question, you should contact the RPM or LPM assigned to the ANDA. If you have a general question prior to filing an ANDA application, please submit a controlled correspondence. For more information on what is or isn't appropriate for controlled correspondence submission, please refer to the FDA draft guidance that is supplied on this slide. Lastly, if you have any other questions, you can always email druginfo@fda.hhs.gov. And with that, that concludes our presentation, and we'll be more than happy to take any questions that you may have at this time.
Thank you so much, Rachel and Catherine, for those great presentations. We are going to go into our Q&A portion. Hopefully, we'll have a little bit more success this time around, and I do know that on the agenda we have a little bit more time available to us. So I am going to go ahead and turn it over to Lisa to ask the first question.
Thank you, Jeff. This first question is for Catherine. Is there an email alert or a similar system to notify us when there's an update on the specific reference listed drug?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you great.
All right. So I see this question a lot, and the answer is it's the applicant's responsibility to monitor the drugs at FDA constantly and regularly for any RLD labeling updates. At this time, there are no alerts that could be set up. You just have to be diligent in checking the website.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. Our next question is similar to the challenge question, I think. If a label at Drugs at FDA is an older version and the label at the Daily Med website is a current one, can ANDA applicants use the label at Daily Med website for a side-by-side comparison?
The answer is no. So the official website you should go to check for your RLD labeling is Drugs at FDA. You cannot rely on another RS that's been approved or a Daily Med or FDA label to get your model labeling. You have to use the labeling posted on the Drugs at FDA website for your NDA.
Okay, great. And a follow-up to that is, who should the sponsor or the ANDA holder, who should they contact if the updated RLD labeling is not actually posted on Drugs at FDA?
So if you go to Drugs at FDA and you scroll down to the bottom of the website, there's a Contact Us link that you could use to ask for the last approved RLD labeling to be posted. So when you submit a request, it should get updated fairly quickly within 2 to 3 days.
Okay. Our next question is about storage conditions. So if the storage conditions differ between an RLD and the USP, which one should prevail for the generic?
So you would have to list the storage conditions for your drug product because it is permissible to approve an ANDA that calls for a different storage condition as long as the difference doesn't affect the safety or efficacy of the product. However, if it's a control room temperature statement that is slightly different from the RLD, then it's perfectly fine to use the USP control room temperature statement.
Okay, great. Our next question is for Rachel. So Rachel, for a blister pack, if the reference listed drug label does not specify as CRP, I think child-resistant packaging, so does that mean it's mandatory and part of for an ANDA holder to have the CRP for a blister pack?
So this is Catherine. I could take that question. Okay. So we recommend being the same as the RLD as much as you can. So if the RLD doesn't have a child-resistant packaging, you could also opt to not have it. However, if there's some concerns that you think that the product needs child-resistant packaging, then it's perfectly fine to choose to do that. Just to kind of add on to the question about the child-resistant packaging, we also recommend adding the CRP statement. It is voluntary, and when you do add the CRP statement, then you do need to submit a certificate. But I just want to say, ANDAs can have the child-resistant statement even if the RLD does not.
Okay, great. Thank you. So our next question is again about Daily Med. So in a situation where the reference listed drug is discontinued or the label is not available at Drugs at FDA, can a prospective ANDA holder reference the labeling of a reference standard appearing at the Daily Med site?
So I'm assuming this is when the NDA RLD is withdrawn and you cannot obtain the labeling from the Drugs at FDA website. If that is the situation, then you can check on Daily Med to find another ANDA product that references the same RLD. Yes, you are allowed to use a labeling that's listed on Daily Med. But I also want to, refer to the guidance that we have out there published. It's titled Updating ANDA Labeling After the Marketing Application for the RLD Has Been Withdrawn. So please refer to that guidance as well if you are in this situation where you can't obtain the RLD labeling on the Drugs at FDA website.
Okay. So our next question is, can we use FDA label search to refer to the reference listed drug labeling?
So the answer is no. As you know, I've reiterated many times, please go to the Drugs at FDA website because that is where we list the approved labeling for all applications, NDAs, and sometimes ANDAs. So that's what's been approved by the agency. So we always tell applicants to go to that website. We do know there are other websites such as DailyMed and FDA Label, but you should only revert or use those websites if you can't obtain the RLD labeling because it's withdrawn or they're old DESI applications. But again, please go to the Drugs at FDA website to get your RLD labeling.
Thank you. Our next question is, if the RLD insert is not in PLR format, does the generic drug need to update to PLR?
So the answer is no. You always follow the RLD labeling. So if they are not in a PLR format, you do not need to be in a PLR format.
Okay. Our next question is directed at Rachel. What type of submission to be used for filing an RLD labeling when the ANDA is actually under review? What type of submission should be used for filing RLD labeling when the ANDA is under review?
That question isn't very clear to me. I'm assuming you are saying there is an RLD labeling update when there is an ANDA under review, and if that's the case, then you will need to submit a labeling amendment to update your proposed labeling to align with the most recently approved RLD labeling.
Okay. The next question, again, is Rachel or Catherine. How does an applicant address labeling for an ANDA switch to OTC? The reference listed drug has been discontinued.
So there's two situations when the RLD is discontinued from marketing, and then there's a situation where an RLD has been withdrawn and the application is no longer active. In that case, again, I would go to, I guess, a publicly available labeling website like DailyMed to see another generic drug application that's been recently approved, and you could propose a similar labeling for that product when it's switched to OTC, and then once it's submitted, our labeling assessor will review your labeling and provide any comments if necessary.
Okay. So our next question is it mandatory to submit the proposed draft generic labeling in SPL format during an original ANDA submission?
So it is not mandatory to submit your SPL data elements, but we highly encourage it because that allows us to review all the data elements to make sure the information listed in the SPL is consistent with your labels and labeling. Because quite often we see that there's discrepancies, and if you submit the SPL data elements to us, then that allows us to review. It's like a second pair of eyes to correct any deficiencies or inadequate information. So it's not mandatory, but we highly recommend to submit it.
Okay. All right. Our next question is about medication guides. I know that it was mentioned and the medication guide links could be provided electronically. Does that also apply to patient information sheets?
So, providing a website link for the medication guide is not a requirement. It's totally up to the company to add it if there is one. You know, it is useful link to have in the prescribing information and medication guide if, you know, the pharmacists or healthcare providers want to, you know, have access to the medication guide. So it is useful information to have. It's not a requirement. For patient information, it is not, you don't have to add a link to it.
Okay.
To the prescribing information and patient information sheet.
Okay.
And this is Jeff. I'm gonna thank you, Lisa, for reading off all those questions, and thank you, Catherine and Rachel, for participating. But I am the timekeeping ogre. We are at 10:30, which is time for our first break. It will be a 15-minute break, and when we come back, we will have our next presentation on pre-ANDA interactions. And hopefully you'll all stick around. We'll see you in just 15 minutes.